first person to have read this scroll in 2,000 years. To his astonishment, it was nearly identical to another copy of Isaiah from the synagogue in Cairo that was dated almost 1,000 years later, to the 10th century CE. It differed from our version today only by some 13 or so minor variants, probably all the result of scribal copying errors over the centuries. One of the other two scrolls, called the Thanksgiving Scroll, contained the previously unknown hymns and prayers of thanks of a community. The third scroll was also unknown. Called the War Scroll, it records the fact that the inhabitants of Qumran, or whomever the scroll belonged to, were waiting for Armageddon, for a final battle between good and evil. They saw themselves as a fighting force, calling themselves the Sons of Light who would be fighting the Sons of Darkness. The scroll outlines how they were to act and live their lives, all the while planning for this battle. Of course, one could say that the battle never happened, but I would argue that, at least for them it did, if one wants to call the Romans the Sons of Darkness. Soon thereafter, four more scrolls appeared on the antiquities market. Archbishop Samuel, who was with the Syrian Orthodox monastery of St. Mark in Jerusalem, was selling them. He had bought them from Kando, the antiquities dealer in Bethlehem, reportedly for $250. And then he offered them to Sukenik, but they were unable to reach an agreement. So, what to do? In January 1949, the Archbishop smuggled the four scrolls into the United States, where they were secretly kept in a Syrian Orthodox church in New Jersey for several years. Then, on June 1, 1954, he placed an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal that read the four Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are for sale. This would be an ideal gift for an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. Box F-206, The Wall Street Journal. It just so happened that Yigal Yadin, the preeminent Israeli archaeologist, was in the United States at that time, lecturing at Johns Hopkins University. The advertisement was brought to his attention and, with the help of a middleman from New York, Yadin purchased the four scrolls for the State of Israel for $250,000. Thus, the seven scrolls were reunited. They are now kept at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, in their own quarters known as the Shrine of the 238 Chapter 14 Book. But the story gets even better, because Yigal Yadin had changed his original name at some point. His birth name was Yigal Sukenik, he was Eliezer Sukenik's son. The son was able to buy the scrolls that had eluded his father, which seems very fitting. Of the four scrolls that Yadin purchased from Archbishop Samuel, one was another copy of the Book of Isaiah, in even better shape than the one that his father had purchased. Another was a copy of what is now called the Manual of Discipline. It contains the rules and regulations for the community to which it belonged, which most people assume is the settlement at Qumran. The third scroll was a commentary on the book of Habakkuk from the Hebrew Bible. Habakkuk was one of the minor prophets, and the book that is attributed to him is not very long, but this commentary is very important. It presents us with three figures, one called the teacher of righteousness and his two opponents, who are called the wicked priest and the man of the lie. None of these figures has been definitely identified, although this scroll has been the focus of much scholarly debate over the years. As for the fourth scroll that Yadin acquired, it is known as the Genesis Apocryphon. Written in Aramaic, the colloquial language of the Jews of those centuries, rather than in Hebrew, it is an alternate version of the book of Genesis, different from the version that we have in our current Bibles. The scroll records a supposed conversation between Noah and his father Lamech, which is a conversation that we don't find in our Bibles today. News of these remarkable documents shook the world of biblical scholarship. It also set off a race between the archaeologists and the Bedouin pastoralists who lived near the Dead Sea, searching for more caves during the 1950s and 1960s. And they found them, one after the other, at least 11 caves in all. By the time that they were done, they had found multiple copies of nearly every book from the Hebrew Bible, except for the Book of Esther. They also found numerous other scrolls that were not religious in nature. Cave 7 had only scrolls that were written in Greek, the language of commerce and of the occupying Roman forces, rather than in Hebrew or in Aramaic, but it is Caves 3 and 4 that have attracted the most interest. Cave 3 contained a scroll that wasn't written. Unearthing the Bible 239. On leather or any other type of parchment, but on sheets of copper. Archaeologists found the scroll in 1952, broken into two parts. In both scholarly and popular literature, it is referred to as the Copper Scroll. There has been a lot written about this scroll, including a lot of nonsense, because it's a treasure map. Plain and simple, no bones about it, it's a treasure map, like the kind a pirate would leave, with X marks the spot. Except that it's not an X in each case, instead it's a detailed set of instructions to 64 different treasures. When they first found the Copper Scroll, which is now kept in a museum in Amman, Jordan, the archaeologists could not unroll it by themselves. In fact, they couldn't unroll it using any means that they knew of, and so they simply cut it up. They took it to Manchester, England, where it was cut into 23 small sections, using a high-speed saw. The cuts went right through the middle of some of the letters, but on the whole the technique worked, so that the rolled-up scrolls now could be laid flat, albeit looking like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle, but all approximately the same size and shape. Most of the Copper Scroll is written in Hebrew, but there also are some Greek letters and what appear to be numbers as well. But it is the directions that are most bizarre and that explain, at least to me, why none of the 64 treasures listed on the scroll has ever been located. The first set, for example, says, "In the ruin which is in the valley, pass under the steps leading to the east 40 cubits, a chest of money, and its total, the weight of 17 talents. In the sepulchral monument, in the third course, 100 gold ingots. In the great cistern of the courtyard of the peristyle, in a hollow in the floor covered with sediment, in front of the upper opening, 900 talents. But which ruin? Which valley? Which cistern? Which peristyle? It's not clear at all which valley, monument, or cistern is meant." The Copper Scroll continues like this for column after column after column of text. No wonder nobody has ever found any of the treasures. It's also not clear at all where the treasures were from or whether they were even real. If they were real, then they were most likely the annual tithes that people were sending to the temple in Jerusalem, except that during the first Jewish revolt it was not safe to send such tithes there, so they were hidden instead. Still, one would think that if such were the 240 chapter 14 case, then something should have been found long ago. That's why other scholars suggest that they were found long ago, but back in antiquity, soon after they were buried. It remains a mystery that various amateur archaeologists try to solve from time to time, without any luck. There was another scroll that was found by the Bedouin in Cave 11. It made its way to Kando's shop in Bethlehem, just like some of the first ones. It was initially offered for sale, apparently via a clergyman in Virginia acting as a middleman, but then it came into Yigal Yadin's hands after the Six-Day War in 1967. The main part of it had been kept in a shoebox, with other fragments in a smaller cigar box. When it was very carefully unrolled and the various fragments reattached, it turned out to be what is now known as the Temple Scroll. It has explicit details about the construction and appearance of a Jewish temple that was never built, complete with regulations about sacrifices and various temple practices. Yadin eventually published the whole story of its acquisition, and the scroll itself remains an object of intense study today. It was Cave 4, however, that created a real mess in the world of archaeology and scholarship, for the scrolls found in that cave had all fallen from the shelves where they had originally been and had disintegrated into a mass of fragments on the floor. The original scrolls were now in tens of thousands of fragments, some smaller than a fingernail. The original scholarly committee that was formed to piece the fragments back together and publish them worked on them for more than 40 years, with few other scholars even allowed to see them. This created all sorts of ill will, not to mention conspiracy theories about what might be contained in the texts that the scholars were painstakingly putting back together. In the end, the bottleneck was broken from several different directions, almost all at once, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. One involved photographs of the scroll fragments, which were left at one scholar's front door by someone who still remains anonymous. Another involved a professor and his graduate student who reconstructed what was on the scroll fragments by working from a set of index cards that they had been given, each of which had a single word from a scroll on it. Along with the word that appeared before that word and the word that appeared after that word in the original scroll. This is known as a compendium, copies of which were given out by the scroll team to trusted. Unearthing the Bible 241. Scholars. This professor and his graduate student created a computer program that matched the cards up and reconstructed the original contents of the fragments with about 90% accuracy. The most important revelation was that other photographs of all the fragments had been taken at one point, unbeknownst to most people, and were stored in a vault for safekeeping at the Huntington Museum Library in Los Angeles. Once this fact was revealed and the Huntington declared in 1991 that anyone with proper scholarly credentials could access the microfilm copies of them, the floodgates opened. A new group of scholars was assembled to work on the fragments, and volume after volume has since appeared in rapid succession. Some of the most interesting developments came about because women and Jews were among the new scholars working on the texts. The original team had been all male and all Christian. The new scholars brought new backgrounds and new approaches to the study of the scrolls. New techniques also were used on the scroll fragments, such as taking infrared photographs, which allowed for much clearer reading of some of the writing. Studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, ranging from the whole ones to the completely fragmentary, has become a cottage industry within academia. An immense number of publications have now appeared, from the most scholarly to the most popularizing. And the intense study has yielded some remarkable observations, for example, that the earliest fragment dates to the late 3rd century BCE and is from the Book of Samuel. There is another fragment from the Book of Samuel that contains a passage that was missing from our copies of the Bible. Here, in 1 Samuel 10:11, 2 paragraphs in a row begin with the same person's name, Nahash, king of the Ammonites. Most likely a scribe recopying the manuscript looked up after writing the first paragraph and then, when looking down again, saw the same man's name at the beginning of the second paragraph and, thinking that he had already copied that paragraph, went on to the next paragraph. In fact, he had only copied the first paragraph, not both. As a result, our modern Bibles were missing that second paragraph. Many versions today have now restored that missing paragraph, on the basis of this discovery in the Dead Sea Scrolls. pp. 242 Chapter 14. The archaeologists found other caves in the region of the Dead Sea that had remnants of scrolls and ancient writing, as well as other objects, but they are probably unrelated to the main body of the Dead Sea Scrolls, since the remains found in them are from other periods. One of the best known is a cave in a wadi, or canyon or valley, called Nahal Mishmar. In what is now known as the Cave of the Treasure, archaeologists found a tremendous hoard of about 400 copper objects dating to the Chalcolithic period, about 3500 BCE. A number of them were mace heads, more likely ceremonial than functional, others look like crowns and scepters, though it is not clear whether this is how they were actually used. 2 other caves are even more famous. Located in a wadi called Nahal Hever, which is about 25 miles south of Qumran, they are called the Cave of Horrors and the Cave of Letters. One is located in the cliff face that makes up the northern side of the wadi, the other is in a similar location on the southern side. Both had a Roman siege camp built on the top of the cliff directly above them, and both are on such a steep slope that it is best to reach them now by precarious rope ladders. Both caves were first discovered in 1953, but were not truly investigated and excavated until 1960 and 1961, as part of an effort by teams led by 4 distinguished Israeli archaeologists, including Adnan. The first one, the Cave of Horrors, is called that because of the grisly discoveries that the archaeologists made in there. They found 40 skeletons in the cave, all dating to the time of the Second Jewish Revolt against Roman rule, known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. The rebellion lasted from 132 to 135 CE and was unsuccessful. The bodies found in this cave are thought to have been refugees or rebels who were unable to get out or escape from the cave because of the Romans camped directly above them, no doubt very deliberately. They may well have starved to death, since there was no evidence of trauma, but we may never know the real story of what happened in the Cave of Horrors. In contrast, we know an amazing amount about the Cave of Letters. Yadin was in charge of exploring this cave in 1960 and 1961, although it had already been fairly thoroughly examined by archaeologists in 1953. It turned out to be extremely rich, with finds from 3 periods. One period was the Chalcolithic, from about 3500 BCE, contemporary with the Cave of the Treasure in Nahal Mishmar. A second period was the Unearthing the Bible 243. 1st century CE, perhaps during the time of the First Jewish Revolt when all the scrolls had been hidden in the caves closer to Qumran. The third period was the 2nd century CE, that is, the time of the Second Jewish Revolt. The cave has 2 narrow entrances, both leading into what is called Hall A. In the hall, archaeologists found a fragment from a scroll with part of the Book of Psalms, reading, "O Lord, who shall sojourn in thy tents?" Using a metal detector, they also found a number of additional objects, including metal vessels and coins. From Hall A, a narrow tunnel leads to Halls B and C. It's in Hall C that the most important and grisly finds were made, including a basket of human skulls found in a crevice along with a skeleton wrapped in a blanket and a child buried in a box lined with leather. In the farthest reaches of the hall, they found correspondence written by Bar Kokhba. There also were metal keys and a basket made of palm fronds, which was filled with objects such as a mirror, keys, leather sandals, wooden bowls, bronze jugs, and, perhaps most important, an archive of letters wrapped in a bundle of rags belonging to a woman named Babatha. Also dating to the time of Bar Kokhba and the Second Jewish Revolt. It turned out that there were at least 3 men, 8 women, and 6 children whose skeletons were found in Hall C within the cave. The correspondence written by Bar Kokhba was on wooden slates all wrapped up in papyri. One of them read Simeon Bar Kosiba, President. Over Israel. There is an unconfirmed story that when Yadin went to the President of Israel to personally tell him of the discovery, he saluted and said, "Message from your predecessor, sir." The material in Babatha's archive included 35 papyrus rolls, which were mostly legal documents regarding property that she had inherited from her father and the guardianship of her son. David Harris, a photographer who was there on the day that they were discovered, later wrote, as Yadin checked to make sure he had missed nothing, his hand touched a bundle of rags. When he brought it out, he could see a hoard of papyrus rolls wrapped together, what we now call the Baba the Archive, describing everyday life during the Bar Kosiba period. 35 years later, I remember that wonderful and exciting experience as the greatest in my life as a photographer. 244 Chapter 14. The discoveries in the Cave of the Treasure, the Cave of Horrors, and the Cave of Letters contributed dramatic new material to the field of biblical archaeology. It was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, however, that absolutely revolutionized the field of biblical studies by shedding light on the Hebrew Bible according to texts that date more than 2,000 years ago. From their accidental discovery, to the intrigue of their trade on the antiquities market, right through to the academic controversies they have ignited, all these elements make the Dead Sea Scrolls one of the most enthralling archaeological finds of the 20th century. In 73 or 74 CE, 960 Jewish zealots, men, women, and children, committed suicide on top of the mountain of Masada by the Dead Sea in Israel rather than be captured by the Romans. The story, told to us by the Roman historian Josephus, is one of the most famous from antiquity. But did it actually happen? Yigal Yadin, the Israeli archaeologist from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem who excavated the site in the mid-1960s, said that it did. Moreover, he also said that the objects found during his dig proved it. The book that he subsequently published, Masada, Herod's Fortress and the Zealot's Last Stand, was a bestseller. It was no secret that Yadin's excavations at various sites in Israel, such as at Hazor in the 1950s and at Masada in the 1960s, were in part undertaken in the hope of reinforcing Jewish claims to the land by linking them to biblical stories and other famous events, including the story that Josephus tells. Some have long felt that this desire may have affected his interpretations of the finds made during his excavations. In 1995 and 2002, Nachman Ben Yehuda, a sociologist also at the Hebrew University. 1.5. Mystery at Masada. 246 Chapter 15. Of Jerusalem, published his own interpretation of the finds from Masada in 2 separate books, The Masada Myth and Sacrificing Truth. He concluded that Yadin had been incorrect in many of his interpretations, perhaps deliberately so. In the interest of creating a nationalist narrative out of the remains that he found at Masada and helping the young state of Israel create an identity for itself and its citizens that was based on archaeology. Subsequently, in 2009, Amnon Bentor, who is now the Yigal Yadin Professor of Archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and who had excavated with Yadin at Masada, published a spirited defense of Yadin and his findings, titled Back to Masada. In it, Ben-Tor went through the archaeology again, dismissing each of Ben Yehuda's points and basically confirming Yadin's interpretations and conclusions. The debate involves the trustworthiness of Josephus's account, the credibility of Yadin, perhaps the most famous of all Israeli archaeologists, and the influence of nationalism on the interpretation of archaeological discoveries. Who do we believe? PPPP. Masada is a tall mountain with a flat plateau on top, longer than it is wide, rising high above the surrounding dry and arid desert. It has been a tourist attraction ever since Yadin's excavations in the mid-1960s. Hundreds of tourists a day now roam around the ruins on top of the mountain, 500,000 visit every year. It is the second most popular tourist site in Israel, after Jerusalem, and was named a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 2001. It lies at the southern end of the Dead Sea, far to the south of Qumran and most of the caves in which the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The top is accessible on foot only via a narrow winding track known as the Snake Path that leads 400 meters up the front face of the massif and the Roman siege ramp still in place on the western side. It gets so hot here that rules have been put into place instructing tourists that they may begin the climb only if it is before 9:30 in the morning. There's too much chance of getting dehydrated during the ascent after that. Those who begin climbing before dawn are rewarded with one of the most spectacular sunrises that they. Mystery at Masada 247. Will ever see, but most tourists opt to ride up in the cable cars that have been installed, gliding above the snake path and waving to those below. The work that Yadin conducted at Masada over 2 excavation seasons, from October 1963 to May 1964 and again from November 1964 to April 1965, was a milestone for archaeology in several ways. For example, Yadin was the first to use international volunteers to help dig the site. He recruited participants by placing ads in newspapers, both in Israel and in England, and wound up with volunteers from 28 countries. Nowadays it is rare for a dig in Israel not to have participants from all over the world, but at that point in time, it was a novelty. The sheer numbers that took part is also amazing. Yadin claims to have had no fewer than 300 volunteers digging at Masada at any given moment during his excavations. Those included volunteers from the Israel Defense Forces, high school students, and kibbutz members, in addition to the international participants. The logistics of running the dig were staggering. Archaeologists active today, who were graduate students at the time, talk about Masada 248 Chapter 15. Helicopters sometimes being commandeered to fly tools and equipment up to the top of the mound, though the more usual route was to carry everything up the western side of the mound, via the Roman siege ramp, which provided the best access to the mountaintop for heavily laden volunteers. In the case of heavier equipment, a cable system next to the ramp was used. The tents in which the expedition members lived were pitched at the foot of this same Roman ramp, for logistical reasons. All this Yadin confirms in his book. The excavation itself has become the stuff of legend. Yadin says that when they first began planning the excavation, they couldn't see any structures with a recognizable plan on top of Masada. The entire area, he says, seemed to be covered with mounds of stone and rubble. In actuality, many of the buildings could be seen quite plainly once the team took aerial photographs so that they knew where to dig in many cases. By the time they finished the excavations, they had discovered that Masada was an elaborate palatial settlement, originally built by King Herod after his successful journey to Rome in 40 BCE, in case he ever had to flee Jerusalem and seek refuge elsewhere. It was later taken over and occupied by the Sicarii rebels fighting Rome in the aftermath of the First Jewish Revolt more than 7 decades later. Masada actually boasted 2 palaces. One was at the northern end of the rock plateau. It had 3 levels embedded in the side of the cliff and was placed to grab summer breezes in the intense heat of the Judean desert. The other palace was on Masada's western side. In addition to the 2 palaces, Yadin's team found rooms and buildings that served as tanneries, workshops, and even a synagogue. They also found numerous storage areas to hold food and other provisions, some of which had jars that still contained charred grain from the final destruction, and many cisterns for holding rainwater, for there was no fresh water to be had in the arid desert region that surrounded Masada. Some of the walls were covered in plaster painted with images in deep blues, brilliant reds, yellow, and black, of which only fragments now remain. A few of the floors were inlaid with mosaics featuring elaborate designs like those found more commonly in Greece or Rome. Presumably artisans hired by Herod the Great created these, perhaps to emulate what he had seen in Rome. Only parts of them now remain. Mystery at Masada 249. Yadin reconstructed some of the original buildings from the fallen stones that they found. The best example of this at Masada was the large complex of storerooms that were in the northeastern part of the site. Here just the lower portions of the walls were left, but the stones from higher up in the walls were all lying right where they had fallen. Yadin and his team reconstructed the walls and rooms, using every available stone to rebuild the walls, which turned out to be 11 feet high. In order to show what they had done, and what they had reconstructed, they painted a black line to separate the lower part that they had excavated from the upper part that they had reconstructed. This is still done at some sites in Israel today. For instance, something similar can be seen at Megiddo on a walk through the late Bronze Age gate when entering the ancient city. Yadin says they put every grain of earth through a special sieve. Nearly 50,000 cubic yards of dirt was sifted. It was the first time that every single bucket of dirt had been sifted at an excavation in Israel. As a result, they found numerous small items that would probably otherwise have been missed, including hundreds of coins, pieces of pottery with inscriptions on them, and small pieces of jewelry like rings and beads. The coins allowed him to date very precisely the remains that they were uncovering, particularly the coins that had been made just a few years earlier, during the First Jewish Revolt. They included coins from all 5 years of the revolt, including several very rare ones from the revolts last year. Yadin's excavations at Masada have been the subject of much debate in recent years, however, especially over his interpretation of the remains and his use of them in reconstructing the ancient narrative of what happened at the site. His publication appeared just a year after the dig ended, as a large coffee table book, in one of the first excavation reports ever aimed at a popular audience. In contrast, the official publications of the results have taken up 8 additional volumes and the efforts of dozens of scholars working for decades, with the most recent volume appearing in 2007, more than 40 years after the original excavation ended. The story of Masada is therefore more than just a story of the archaeological excavations. It is an example of how archaeologists use historical information to supplement what they find during their excavations. 250 Chapter 15. And to flesh out the bare details provided by the archaeological discoveries. Yadin made particular use of the writings of Flavius Josephus, the Jewish general turned Roman historian who wrote 2 books about the Jews in the 1st century CE and who was the primary source for what may have taken place on top of Masada nearly 2,000 years ago. But the relationship between archaeology and the historical record cuts both ways. In other words, since we cannot be certain that Josephus's discussions are 100% accurate, we can use archaeology to corroborate, or to challenge, the ancient text. But the event also serves as a cautionary tale about using archaeological evidence to support a nationalistic agenda, as some scholars have suggested Yadin did in this case. Pp. It was in 73 or 74 CE that the Romans mounted a siege against a small group of Jewish rebels at Masada. Josephus is our only historical source for information about that siege. The story that he tells, of a mass suicide by the Jewish defenders, had long been known. And in fact, Yadin was using the archaeology to try to corroborate the details that Josephus gives. That story is briefly told. As we have previously noted in the chapter on Rome, the first Jewish rebellion began in 66 CE, when the Jews in what is now Israel rose up against the Romans who were occupying their land. The revolt lasted until 70 CE, at which point the Romans captured Jerusalem and burnt most of it to the ground, including the temple that had been built there by Herod the Great to replace the original one constructed by King Solomon, which had been destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian centuries earlier. It is said that both the first and second temples, that is, those built by Solomon and Herod, respectively, were destroyed on the same day of the year, which is today a Jewish day of mourning known as Tisha B'Av. When the rebellion ended, a group of rebels managed to escape the destruction of Jerusalem and settled at Masada. Led by a man named Eleazar ben Yoir, these were the Sicarii, or dagger men. They took over the fortified buildings and palaces that Herod had originally built on top of Masada as a place of last refuge for himself and his family, should he ever need it. Mystery at Masada 251. In his account of what happened, though, Josephus got some of the details wrong, and so we suspect that perhaps he wasn't ever there himself, but was using someone else's notes. For instance, he says that Herod built a palace at the western ascent, but inclined to its north side. In actuality, as noted, the archaeologists found two palaces, not one, at the west and at the north, on top of Masada. Some of the other details that Josephus gives, though, are quite correct. For instance, he describes the baths that were built there, the fact that the floors in some of the buildings were paved with stones of several colors, and that many pits were cut into the living rock to serve as cisterns. Josephus must be referring to the sort of mosaics that Yadin found still partially intact on some of the floors. As to the cisterns that he mentions, some that were dug into the rock on top of Masada were simply enormous. Yadin estimated that they each had a capacity of up to 140,000 cubic feet of water. Added together, they could hold almost 1.4 million cubic feet, or more than 10 million gallons, of water. In the end, the rebel group held out for 3 years, raiding the surrounding countryside for food, until the Romans decided to put an end to them and the final remnants of the rebellion. Josephus says that the Romans, led by General Flavius Silva, surrounded Masada with a wall that went the entire way around the mountain on the desert floor, with separate garrisons or fortresses built at spaced intervals along the wall, so that no one could escape. Today, 8 of Flavius's fortresses can still be seen from the top of Masada when looking down at the surrounding countryside. Next, the Romans began constructing a long ramp built of earth and stones, making use of a natural ridge that reached from the desert floor to within 300 cubits of the top of Masada. Once the ramp was constructed, siege engines, like a battering ram and catapults that flung large stones and ballistae that shot huge arrows, could be wheeled upon its length and used against the walls of Masada. Josephus notes, there was a tower made of the height of 60 cubits, and all overplated with iron, out of which the Romans threw darts and stones from the engines, and soon made those that fought from the walls of the place to retire, and would not let them lift up their heads above the works. Today, full-size replicas of some of these siege engines can be seen at the site. They were left there after ABC filmed a miniseries about Masada. 252 Chapter 15. That aired in 1981. Yadin and the other archaeologists uncovered other objects during their excavations in the 1960s that also can still be seen at the site, including what look like catapult balls that were flung up by the Romans and possibly slingstones that were thrown back down by the Jewish defenders. After the Roman siege engines were set up, the real siege began. Josephus tells us that General Silva ordered the battering ram to be dragged up the ramp and set against the wall. Several men grabbed the rope that was tied to the great piece of pointed wood that formed the battering ram and pulled it back. When they let go, the ram smashed against the fortification wall with a huge crash. It wasn't going to be long before they had breached the wall. The Jewish defenders, however, had created their own wall just inside, which was made of wood and earth, so that it would be soft and yielding, as Josephus tells us. He says that they laid down great beams of wood lengthwise right next to the inside of the wall, then did the same about 10 feet or so away, so that they had 2 large stacks of wooden beams. In between the 2 stacks, they poured earth, so that in the end, they had an extremely thick wall with wood on both sides and an earthen core. This second wall, set up against the stone fortification wall, helped to absorb the blows of the battering ram, spreading the impact. Thus, it took the Romans far longer than they expected to knock a hole in the wall. And even when they did punch a hole in the outer wall, they were still faced with this thick wood and earth wall. In the end, they simply set fire to it, Josephus says, and then made preparations to enter the city. By the time the flames had died down, night had fallen, and Josephus says that the Romans returned to their camps for the night and prepared to overrun the defenders the next morning. This brief respite from the Roman attack provided the Jewish defenders the time and opportunity to decide to kill themselves rather than be killed or taken prisoner and enslaved by the Romans. Josephus says that Eleazar ben Yoir, their leader, asked each family man to kill his own wife and children, declaring, "It is still in our power to die bravely, and in a state of freedom, which has not been the case of others, who were conquered unexpectedly. Mystery at Masada 253. The men then drew lots, choosing 10 of their number to kill all the others. The 10 then drew lots and selected one to kill the other 9. He then killed himself, thereby becoming the only person to commit suicide, technically speaking, which is against Jewish law. In effect, though, it was a mass suicide, and when the Romans entered the next morning, they were greeted by a vast silence. Only when 2 women and 5 children emerged from their hiding place in a cistern did the Romans learn the truth of what had happened, for the women told them of Eleazar's speech, repeating it word for word. According to Josephus, 960 people died that night. PPPP. The dramatic story has reverberated down through the ages until the present day. In fact, after Yadin's excavations at the site, the Israeli army used to hold its induction ceremonies for new recruits up on top of Masada, making them swear at a dramatic nighttime ritual in front of a blazing bonfire that never again would they allow such a thing to happen. Problems with Josephus's story remain, not least of which is the fact that if the 2 women and 5 children really had been hiding in the cistern, there is no way that they would have been able to hear Eleazar ben Yoar's speech. And hear it so clearly that they were able to repeat it, and Josephus could quote it word for word. A larger problem is the fact that, if the Romans had punched a hole in the wall even as night was falling, they would never have returned to their camps for the evening. Roman military tactics at the time called for them to press the advantage whenever and wherever they had it, regardless of the time of day or night. Thus, they would have gone straight through the breached and burning wall, leaving no time for a discussion of the plan and a vote on it, Ben Yoar to make his speech, for successive lots to be drawn, no time for the husbands to kill their wives and families, no time for the 10 men to kill the others, and no time for the last man to kill the other 9. In short, it couldn't have happened as Josephus has described it. More likely what happened was exactly what we might have expected. When the Romans breached the wall, they poured in and massacred. 254 Chapter 15. The Jewish Defenders. It was not a mass suicide, but a mass slaughter. Josephus, writing later back in Rome and using notes and daybooks from the commanding officers who were present, probably was asked to whitewash the whole thing. In fact, Josephus took the story that he tells about the men killing their families, 10 men killing the others, and then 1 man killing the rest, from his own experience. Several years earlier, in 67 CE, during the initial rebellion against Rome, Josephus had been a Jewish general fighting the Romans at a site called Jotapata. They managed to hold off the Romans for 47 days, but in the end he and 40 others took refuge in a cave, where they decided to commit suicide, with each man killing another, rather than surrender. In the end, only Josephus was left alive with 1 other man, whom he persuaded to surrender with him. The story Josephus tells us of what happened at Masada seems to be the story of what happened to him at Jotapata. PPPP. It was with some of these Josephus-related problems in mind, including the story of the women and children hiding in the cistern while the rest of the people committed suicide, that Yadin decided to go to Masada. He wanted to excavate, to see what he could find and either prove or disprove the story. Some of what he found, and how he interpreted it, remains a matter of great debate. The architecture and the objects themselves are not debated, the question lies in how they should be interpreted. For instance, among the objects that Yadin found were belt buckles, door keys, arrowheads, spoons, rings, and other items made of iron, in addition to much pottery and numerous coins. He interpreted these as belonging to the Jewish defenders of Masada, as indeed they might have, but some may have belonged to the Roman besiegers or even to later inhabitants or squatters at the site. He also found fragments of scrolls, including scraps from the Book of Psalms, one containing portions of Psalms 81 to 85 and another from the last chapter in the book, Psalm 150, which reads, "Praise ye the Lord. Praise him with the sound of the trumpet." Other very important but fragmentary non-biblical texts also were in place, including a Mystery at Masada 255. Fragment from a scroll whose lines of text are identical to one found in the Dead Sea Caves at Qumran, which led Yadin, and many other scholars since then, to wonder whether there was any connection between the defenders of Masada and the inhabitants of Qumran. Perhaps most important, Yadin also found bodies at the site, though fewer than 30 in all, some with hair still intact and leather sandals nearby. It is these that have generated the most debate in recent years. 25 of them were in a cave near the top of the southern cliff face. They were given a state funeral in 1969, though over Yadin's objections, since he said they couldn't be sure whether they were the Jewish defenders of Masada, the Roman attackers, or some other group of people. Perhaps from a different period altogether. 3 other bodies were found near a small bathhouse on the lower terrace of the northern palace. Amnon Bentor, the current director of the excavations at Hazor, says that he was the one who excavated these 3 skeletons and that it was the most thrilling day in his professional life. In the book that he published, Yadin made the most out of these 3 bodies, stating that when they first came across the remains, even the veterans and the more cynical among us stood frozen, gazing in awe at what had been uncovered. One of the bodies, Yadin said, was that of a man of about 20, perhaps one of the commanders of Masada. Next to him were armor scales, dozens of arrows, an inscribed potsherd, and fragments of a prayer shawl. Nearby, on a plaster floor stained with what looked like blood, was the skeleton of a young woman. Her hair was still preserved, beautifully plaited, as if it had just been freshly coiffured. Her sandals also were preserved, next to her body. The third body, Yadin said, was that of a child. Yadin believed that they formed a family group who died in close proximity to each other. This has been the focus of much debate over the years, as have the pottery sherds with names written on them in ink that he found, including one that says Ben Yair. To Yadin, these bodies and the sherds confirmed Josephus's story and the existence of Eliezer ben Yair. Unfortunately for Yadin, more recent forensic analysis indicates that the members of the so-called family group that he wrote about were 256 Chapter 15. Only a few years apart in age and couldn't possibly have been a family. The man was more likely about 22 years old, the woman was 18, and the child was a boy about 11 years old. There are other problems as well, including the fact that there were 11 inscribed sherds found instead of 10, pig bones were mixed in with some of the burials, and so on. These were duly listed in the books written by Ben Yehuda and then dismissed in turn by Bentor. PPPP. Regardless of whether one follows Ben Yehuda or Bentor in reviling or revering Yadin, Bentor's concluding remarks in the book that he wrote in defense of Yadin still ring true. As he said, placing Masada on the scientific agenda. On the one hand, and in the public consciousness as a tourist site on the other, are both the proper expression and a true monument to the 2 aspects of Yadin's personality, the scholar and the public figure. Overall, Yadin's excavations at Masada served as a milestone for archaeology in Israel, especially for use of multinational volunteers and numerous other aspects of the logistics of the operation. They remain significant today for tourism, of course, but also because they are at the heart of recent discussions on the nature of interpretations made by archaeologists, especially those who may or may not have a nationalist agenda beyond a simple reading of the data that they have uncovered. ILTHUF sites in modern Israel and Palestine are perhaps better known to the general public because of their biblical connections. They are not necessarily the most extensive or impressive archaeological sites in the Middle East. Other ruined cities and ancient tells abound farther north and east in Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, though Western tourists visit them less frequently because of their remoteness and because of political instability in the past several decades. We have already touched on a number of the sites, including Ur, Nimrud, and Nineveh in Iraq. Here we will briefly describe 3 more, Ebla and Palmyra in Syria and the desert entrepot of Petra in Jordan. Ebla first made headlines around the world in the 1970s. Paolo Matthew from the Sapienza University of Rome and his team began digging at the site in 1964 and continued almost until the present, nearly 50 years in all. It has taken that long to excavate because the site is absolutely huge, covering about 140 acres. The earthen ramparts that protected the city can still be seen clearly, though there is 1-6 Cities of the Desert. 258 Chapter 16. Now a road through them, on which one can drive in order to gain entrance to the rest of the site. There is a huge lower city and then a citadel, a higher mound, right in the middle of the site. On the citadel are the royal palaces and administrative buildings. For years after starting the excavation, Matthew's team found a statue that had been dedicated nearly 4,000 years earlier by a local man named Ibitlim. In the inscription, this man said he was the son of the king of Ebla. This was quite a revelation, since previous scholars had thought that Ebla was located farther north in Syria, not here at Tel Marduk. After further digging, they were able to confirm that they had indeed found ancient Ebla. As it turns out, we now know that Ebla is an extremely important site with a long history dating all the way back to the 3rd millennium BC and continuing until it was destroyed in about the year 1600 BCE. Matthew and his team spent the first 9 years working on the portion of the mound and the buildings that dated to the second part of its occupation, from about 2000 to 1600 BCE. They were interested in this period in part because it was the time of the Amorites, who are known from the Bible, and the time of Hammurabi of Babylon, who ruled just after 1800 BCE. It was only after 1973 that Matthew's team began to work on the earlier phase of occupation, which dates from about 2400 to 2250 BCE. The very next year, they made a discovery that catapulted Ebla, and themselves, into the history books. That was the year when they found the first clay tablets at the site. They found more in 1975 and still more in 1976. There may be as many as 20,000 tablets in total, most of which were found in 2 small rooms within so-called Palace G, still lying on the floor where they had fallen after the shelves on which they were placed had burned and then collapsed. They mostly date between 2350 BC and 2250 BCE. Finding this large a library from the early Bronze Age led to headlines around the world. Soon thereafter they made headlines again, and a controversy was ignited, because the initial decipherment by the original epigrapher of the expedition, Giovanni Pettinato, suggested that Sodom and Gomorrah were mentioned, as well as figures from the Bible, such as Abraham, Israel, David, and Ishmael. Cities of the Desert 259. It's hard to recall now just how excited people got, but the euphoria many felt soon dissipated when subsequent research by epigraphers showed that the tablets said nothing of the sort. No Sodom or Gomorrah, no Abraham, Israel, David, or Ishmael. The mistaken interpretation had been made because the tablets were written in a previously unknown language, now called Eblate, which made use of Sumerian cuneiform signs. Pettinato thought he could read it, since he knew Sumerian, the earliest known written language of southern Iraq 1,000 miles away, but he ended up completely mistranslating it. Subsequently, Pettinato cut his ties with Matthey and also resigned from the international committee that Matthey had appointed to translate and publish the tablets. He continued to publish about them, however, in several books and articles, even though a new chief epigrapher, named Alfonso Archi, from the University of Rome, had replaced him. The Ebla tablets are extremely important historically, even though they contain no biblical references at all. They do include lists of kings who ruled at Ebla, treaties, place names, evidence of international trade, and confirmation of the existence of a scribal school, where students learned how to read and write. They also proved that Ebla was a major center, ruling over a kingdom that we previously had no idea existed. This is an extremely good example where the textual evidence found by the archaeologists supplements and amplifies the other archaeological data that have come to light over the years. As to the archaeological data, a number of the palaces and buildings at Ebla were destroyed by fire, which was terrible for them, but very good for the archaeologists, because it preserved the ruins and some of the artifacts within them. The smaller objects include a human-headed bull figure made of gold and steatite and fragments of ivory that once adorned pieces of wooden furniture. The furniture is now long gone and most of the ivory fragments were burnt black by the fire, but the fragments do survive and can be somewhat reconstructed. There's also a fragment from the lid of a stone bowl that has the name of the Old Kingdom Egyptian pharaoh Pepi I inscribed on it, which implies some sort of connection, even if indirect, between Egypt and Ebla. Matthey and his team stopped digging at the site in 2011 because of the Syrian civil war. Since then, it has been damaged and looted. 260 Chapter 16. Mercilessly. Tunnels have been dug, burial caves full of skeletons have been ransacked, with the bones thrown away, and incalculable harm has been done. Only when the current violence racking the country has been reduced and it is deemed safe to return to the area again will we know the extent of the looting and damage. PPPP. But Ebla is not the only ancient site in Syria, or elsewhere in the Middle East, to have been affected by recent violence in the region. The desert site of Palmyra also suffered damage as a result of mortar fire and other actions during the Syrian civil war, especially in 2012 and 2013. It was again in the news in May and June 2015 and suffered even more damage when the forces of ISIS overran the site, and then again in August 2015 when ISIS killed Dr. Khaled al-Assad, the former director of Palmyra Antiquities. Later, they also blew up two of the most famous temples as well as other monuments at the site, including the Triumphal Arch that had been standing for nearly 2,000 years, sparking a worldwide outcry against their actions. They were finally dislodged and ousted from the site by Syrian forces in March 2016. The Triumphal Arch had stretched across the main street of the city near its eastern end. The Roman Emperor Septimius Severus built it around the year 200 CE, possibly to celebrate his victory over the Parthians in Mesopotamia, an area not too far from Palmyra. Just 6 months after ISIS blew up the arch, it was recreated in Trafalgar Square in London, using three-dimensional technology and Egyptian marble, at 2/3 its original size. After being on show for 3 days, the replica was sent to be displayed in other cities around the world, including New York and Dubai. As much of the world now knows, the ancient site of Palmyra is located in an oasis deep in the Syrian desert, to the northeast of Damascus. It is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, having been given that designation in 1980. Known as Tadmor in antiquity, the city was active already during the Bronze Age in the 2nd millennium BCE, but had its real heyday during the time of the Roman Empire, especially during the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, when it was a major Nabatean city. Cities of the Desert 261. Although the Nabateans themselves are still a bit of a mystery, we know that they were major players in the international trade routes that connected the Roman Empire to India and even to faraway China. Palmyra was one of their cities, serving as a major stop on the caravan routes leading across the desert. Its architecture reflected foreign influences, especially Greco-Roman and Persian. The city rebelled against the Romans in the early 270s CE, in what is known as the Rebellion of Queen Zenobia. Zenobia was married to the king of Palmyra. He was assassinated in 267 CE, when their young son was only a year old, and so Zenobia assumed the throne as regent. Soon afterward she initiated a revolt against Rome that lasted for 5 years or more. Initially, she and her army had a great deal of success, capturing Egypt, taking over the rest of Syria and what today we would call Israel and Lebanon, and even portions of modern-day Turkey. It was only in 273 CE that the Roman army crushed the Palmyrene army and put down her rebellion, after which the Roman Emperor Aurelian destroyed the city. The city was rebuilt, but it was never the same again. According to some ancient sources, Zenobia herself was taken to Rome as a prisoner and was marched through the streets in Triumphal Arch, Palmyra. 262 Chapter 16. Golden chains the following year as part of the triumphal parade that Aurelian staged to celebrate his victory. What happened to her after that is open to debate. Marriage to a Roman, execution, and suicide are all various tales of her final days that have come down to us from ancient authors. Still, along with Boudica, who had led a revolt against the Romans in Britain 2 centuries earlier, Zenobia remains one of the best-known female military leaders from antiquity. The first major excavations at the site, especially of the Roman period ruins, began in 1929 by French archaeologists. The remains that they uncovered, including the Temple of Bel and the Agora, or marketplace, are very impressive, especially the parts that have been partially reconstructed. Both Swiss and Syrian archaeologists also have excavated there, but the most consistent presence has been that of Polish archaeologists, who were excavating right up until 2011, when they were forced to leave at the beginning of the civil war in Syria, before ISIS invaded the area. In calmer and safer times, Palmyra is an amazing place to visit, especially at sunrise and sunset. A favorite shot for photographers at either dawn or dusk is the 4 pylons, known collectively as the Tetrapylon, which was built at an intersection about halfway down the main street, half a kilometer or so from its eastern end. Septimius Severus erected them at the same time as he erected the Triumphal Arch. Of the pylons now visible, one is original and the others are replicas of concrete that were raised in 1963 by the Syrian Antiquities Department. The street itself is colonnaded and stretches for more than a kilometer, from the Triumphal Arch and the Temple of Bel at its eastern end, past the Roman theater that could seat thousands of people, to a huge funerary temple at the western end. On the columns, about 2/3 of the way up, are little ledges or pedestals on which stood statues of people. These were the donors who had paid for the construction of the street and the colonnade. The inscriptions just below the statues include details about their names and families, from which we have learned quite a bit about the inhabitants of Palmyra. As for the huge temple to Bel, or Baal, who was originally a Canaanite god from the 2nd millennium BCE, the altar within the temple was consecrated in 32 CE. The temple as it looked until fairly recently was probably completed about 100 years later, in the 2nd century CE. Unfortunately, this is one of the temples that ISIS blew up in. Cities of the Desert 263. Late August 2015, thereby destroying a beautiful monument that, like the Triumphal Arch, had been standing for nearly 2,000 years. Also among the ruins at Palmyra is the camp that the Roman Emperor Diocletian built for his soldiers at the end of the 3rd century and beginning of the 4th century CE, which has been a focal point of archaeological excavations. There is also a castle that a local Arab emir built high up on the hill overlooking the city in the 17th century CE, which is still there today and worth a visit, provided that the situation in Syria permits. PPPP. Palmyra is only the second most famous Nabatean site now, thanks in part to Indiana Jones. Even though he is not an accurate portrayal of a real archaeologist, the third film of the series, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, managed to bring the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Petra to the world's attention. View of the treasury at Petra. 264 Chapter 16. Located in the Jordanian desert a few hours' drive south from the modern capital city of Amman, Petra was named one of the new 7 wonders of the world in an internet poll conducted in 2007. It is on the bucket list of many people as a place to visit, especially now that there are huge 5-star hotels with air conditioning in which one can stay. The Jordanians have been careful to protect this site, which now stands in tremendous contrast to the damage done at Palmyra, where the violence in Syria made such protection of the ancient site impossible. Although people were living in the area perhaps as early as the 5th century BCE, the city rose to prominence with the Nabateans beginning in the 4th century BCE. It continued to flourish for more than 500 years, including and especially during the time when the Romans were in this area, from the early 2nd century CE on. Then, after an earthquake destroyed nearly half of Petra in the mid-4th century CE and a second one hit in the 6th century CE, everything came to a halt, no more building activities, no more minting of coins. Petra seems to have been the center of the Nabatean Confederation of Cities, which were focused on controlling the lucrative trade in frankincense, myrrh, spices, and other luxury goods across the Arabian Peninsula, connecting Asia to Egypt. They are known for their hydraulic engineering, which allowed them to bring water from the occasional flash floods into Petra through a series of dams, canals, and cisterns. After the city was essentially abandoned later in the 7th century CE, it was basically lost to history and remembered only by the locals living in its immediate vicinity. It was not until 1812 that Petra was rediscovered by the Western world. That year, a Swiss explorer named Johann Burckhardt came through the area. He was dressed in the Arab garments of the day and called himself Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abi Allah. In this getup, and with an excellent command of Arabic, he was able to travel throughout the Middle East from 1809 until his death from dysentery in 1817. He was just 32 years old when he died. Others followed in his footsteps, including the first U.S. archaeologist. This was John Lloyd Stevens, who emulated Burckhardt in 1836 by dressing as a merchant from Cairo, renaming himself Abdul Hazes and riding down the Wadi Musa into Petra. John Bergen's 1845 poem Petra describes the buildings as from the rock as if by magic grown, eternal, silent, beautiful, alone. It ends. Cities of the Desert 265. With the rather immortal lines, a rose-red city half as old as time. In fact, Bergen had never seen Petra himself. He wrote his poem solely from descriptions he had read about the site, especially the travel account published by Stevens a few years earlier, before Stevens headed off to the Yucatan and his famous Maya discoveries. The cliff faces into which many of the remains at Petra are carved do turn rose red at certain times of the day, but they also turn many other colors as well, at various angles of the sun. It is a veritable photographer's paradise. In addition to being a wonderful archaeological site, excavations at the site first started in 1929 and are still ongoing today. Philip Hammond, from the University of Utah, led the initial U.S. expedition to Petra, which started in the 1960s. Hammond, who died in 2008 and is usually described as a colorful character, reportedly used to ride around on a white horse during the excavations. Riding horses, donkeys, or camels is still one of the primary ways to enter the site today. The first view of the site, after a half hour or more of riding down the Sick, or canyon, is absolutely amazing, as anyone who has seen the Indiana Jones movie can attest, even if they haven't yet been to the site themselves. The formal name of the Sick is the Wadi Musa. It's the way that most tourists enter Petra, just as Stevens did a century and a half earlier. It's a very narrow canyon, which twists and turns through sheer rock that towers high above on both sides. This was probably not the main entrance to the city, but rather more of a ceremonial entrance. The final view, featured on postcards and photographs everywhere, is absolutely breathtaking, for the narrow canyon walls suddenly open up onto a huge plaza or open space in front of what we now call the Treasury, which is more formally known as the Kazna. As Stevens later wrote, the first view of that superb facade must produce an effect which could never pass away. Even now, I see before me the facade of that temple, neither the Colosseum at Rome, grand and interesting as it is, nor the ruins of the Acropolis at Athens, nor the pyramids, nor the mighty temples of the Nile, are so often present in my memory. The Kazna was the focus of the Indiana Jones film. The Nabateans carved it out of the soft sandstone of the cliff face, as they did with many other buildings and structures at Petra. Don't believe the film. 266 Chapter 16. Though, the interior rooms of the Kazna, or treasury, are actually very small and there isn't space for too many people to be inside at any one time, even if they include a penitent man. It was probably built to serve as a tomb and was never meant to hold many people. It is called the treasury because of local folklore that there was gold or other valuables hidden in the large urn on the facade, but the urn is solid stone, although it is now riddled with bullet marks from efforts to blast it apart and collect the treasure. Near the heart of Petra is the Street of Facades, which are actually tombs carved into the cliff face, and then the remains of the Roman theater, which could hold more than 8,000 people in 33 rows of seats. A little further on are the so-called royal tombs, which are again carved into the cliff face. The original occupants of these tombs are debated. We don't really know whether they were royal. Even the names don't help, since they are mostly modern designations, like the urn tomb, the silk tomb, the Corinthian tomb, and the palace tomb. The only tomb whose occupant may be known is the tomb of Sextus Florentinus, who was the governor of the Roman province of Arabia in the 2nd century CE. Farther down the colonnaded street, which gets this name from the columns lining it, is the so-called Great Temple. It might not be a temple at all, but it has been called the Great Temple ever since 1921 or so. Some think that it might be the major administrative building for the city, but nobody knows for certain. There are elephant heads on the tops of some of the columns in this structure, but they do not help in figuring out the purpose that it served. Archaeologists from Brown University have been excavating the Great Temple, as well as other parts of Petra, for the past several decades, first under the direction of Martha Jukowski and most recently under the co-direction of Susan Alcock and Chris Tuttle. In 1998, a huge pool measuring about 150 by 70 feet and up to 8 feet deep, as well as an elaborate system for filling it with water, was found and subsequently excavated by Leanne Bettel, who was a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania at the time and now teaches at Penn State Erie, the Barron College. She was leading a team of international, but mostly U.S., archaeologists. They also found the remains of what was probably an elaborate garden built in conjunction with the Cities of the Desert 267 pool, which would have been an amazing sight in antiquity, in this dry desert region. On the hill opposite is the Temple of the Winged Lions that, no surprise, has statues of winged lions in it. It was probably built in the early 1st century CE and then destroyed in an earthquake a little more than 300 years later. It was first found in 1973 using remote sensing and has been excavated by U.S. teams ever since. In the nearby church, which is built over Nabatean and Roman ruins and dates to the end of the Classical period, the 5th and 6th centuries CE, mosaics were found, including one that depicts the seasons. In 1993, while in the process of building a shelter to protect the mosaics and the remains of the church, archaeologists from ACOR uncovered at least 140 carbonized papyrus scrolls within a room in the church. Dating from the 6th century CE, the scrolls had been caught in a fire that, ironically, ended up preserving some of them, although most are now illegible. Papyrologists, experts at deciphering ancient texts, have been able to read a few dozen of them and to determine that they are written in Greek. Most of them have to do with various economic matters such as real estate, marriages, inheritances, and divisions of property, one of them detailing a case involving stolen goods. From this part of Petra, it is possible to proceed on a long stairway to the upper reaches of the site, where the huge temple known as the monastery lies. It is every bit as monumental as the treasury far below, but the climb to visit it is so arduous that it doesn't get as many visitors. Like the treasury, the facade of the monastery is carved into the living face of the rock. It is approximately 130 feet high, just like the treasury, but fully 60 feet wider. From here, there is a commanding view over the entire area. Even though most of the guidebooks say to climb up to the monastery in the late afternoon, I would argue that the hour-long climb is best undertaken in the early morning, before the temperature rises too high. I once was able to stay overnight in the old excavation dig house right in the heart of all these ruins and was able to wake up and begin hiking before dawn. My arrival at the top before daybreak guaranteed an amazing vista as the sun appeared over the horizon, a view that I will never forget. I was able to stop and reflect in utter silence on the long history. 268 Chapter 16 of the region and the remarkable city that was lost for hundreds of years to the outside world, before starting the descent back down. PPPP. Palmyra, Petra, and Ebla are just three of the incredible ancient cities that have been excavated in Jordan and Syria. I equally could have spent time describing the wonders of Jerash and Pella in Jordan, Mari and Ugarit in Syria, and a dozen other remarkable sites. The tragic consequences of the ongoing conflict in the Middle East should serve to remind us of just how precious and fragile these fragments of the past can be. A journalist recently asked me during an interview, all of what you excavate, study, and write about took place so long ago. How can you be so certain of your dates? My short answer to him was radiocarbon, Egyptian texts and other written records, synchronisms, dendrochronology, pottery typology, a plus-minus factor, and a willingness to acknowledge that none of it is fixed in stone. I was a bit surprised at his question, which was asked in a rather aggressive manner. But then it occurred to me that maybe this is something that a lot of other people wonder about as well but are afraid to ask. In fact, one of the questions that I am asked most often at social gatherings is simply a variation of the question that I was asked by the journalist: how do you know how old the things are that you find? I'm also frequently asked, how can things that old still be preserved? Why haven't they crumbled to dust? So here, let's address the topics of how archaeologists date ancient artifacts and what kinds of conditions it takes for such things to be preserved. DIGGINGDEEPR3. How old is this and why is it preserved? 270 Digging Deeper 3. The first question is probably easier to answer: how do we know how old something is? As I said to the journalist, it can be as simple as reading an Egyptian text, especially if it says something like year 8 of a particular pharaoh and we know from other sources what the dates of his rule were. Other times we have synchronisms between cultures or civilizations that interacted, so that we know, for example, from a letter found in the Amarna archive in Egypt that Amenhotep III lived at the same time as Tushratta of the kingdom of Mitanni because they are writing letters back and forth. And we know from other evidence that Amenhotep lived during the early 14th century BCE, so Tushratta must have as well. And in that manner, we can often put together chronological lists of rulers, events, and so on, often using the king lists and astronomical observations left to us by the ancient peoples themselves in Babylonia, Egypt, Assyria, and elsewhere. There also are a variety of scientific dating methods that are now available to the archaeologist. Common methods used to date ancient objects are radiocarbon dating, thermoluminescence, and potassium-argon analysis. They are what we use to determine the absolute date of an object, in other words, its date in calendar years, like 2015 CE or 1350 BCE. It's not always possible to do this, and so sometimes we have to settle for a relative date. For example, level 3 lies below level 2 at the site and is therefore older. The archaeologist might not yet know the absolute date for either level, especially at an early stage in the excavations, but he or she already knows where they are relative to each other. Probably the most commonly used dating method is radiocarbon dating, otherwise known as carbon-14 dating. This, like all the chemical methods, has a plus-minus factor, as in 1450 BCE plus or minus 20 years, and a statistical probability that the date will fall into the suggested range. Because of this, C14 dating isn't particularly useful for things that are relatively close to us in age, but it is good for dating objects that are at least several hundred years old. Several thousand years is even better. The basic idea, discovered by a scientist named Willard Libby who won a Nobel Prize for his work, is that all living things ingest, either through breathing or eating, a small percentage of a radioactive isotope. How old is this and why is it preserved? 271. Of carbon while they are alive, along with all the normal carbon. C14 is constantly being created from radiation in the atmosphere. It combines with oxygen to form a radioactive version of carbon dioxide. Plants incorporate this C14 into their system during photosynthesis. Animals and humans then ingest it by eating the plants. Since it is radioactive, C14 decays, as do all radioactive materials. It has a known half-life of a bit more than 5,700 years, that is, half of the original amount will have decayed and disappeared in a bit more than 5,700 years. Since it is fairly easy to determine how much carbon would have originally been in a particular sample, and since the ratio of C14 atoms to normal C12 atoms is fairly constant, one can measure the amount of C14 that is still left in a sample and thereby figure out the date when that organism died or was chopped down or otherwise ceased to exist. Organic materials like human skeletons, animal bones, pieces of wood, and burnt seeds can be C14 dated. Burnt seeds are especially good, because they usually had a very short shelf life before essentially ceasing to exist. Similarly, short-lived brushwood is good, which is what the Yulubaran excavators used to help date their shipwreck. Radiocarbon dating is relatively cheap to do, at least compared to other dating procedures. The technique can't be used to directly date stone tools or pottery, since those items never ingested C14. It can, however, be used to date organic items that might have been found in the same context as such stone tools or pottery, thereby helping to date stone and pottery by association. There also are some known difficulties and problems associated with the technique, including the fact that it requires the destruction of at least part of the object in order to sample it, and that the amount of C14 in the atmosphere has not always been constant, but has fluctuated. Calibration curves accounting for such fluctuations have been created, as have other means of correction, and so radiocarbon dating has been one of the most frequently used methods to date ancient sites. We use it at both Cabri and Megiddo, the sites where I have worked most recently. In addition, if a large fragment of wood is discovered, like a beam that was once used in a ceiling or wall or even as part of a ship, there is 272 digging deeper 3. Something else that can be done with it besides C14 dating. This is dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, which involves counting the rings that can be seen in the wood. This technique may be familiar to those who have visited places like Yosemite or Sequoia National Park, where often a very large stump of a tree is on display, with little markers attached to some of the rings, saying things like 1620 Pilgrim's Land at Plymouth Rock and 1861, start of the Civil War. The rings in those trees have been fit into a master sequence that has been constructed painstakingly by scientists over the years. If a piece of wood with visible rings is discovered during an excavation, it is sometimes possible to fit it into such a sequence and determine its probable date, but even such master sequences do not extend back in time more than 10,000 or 12,000 years. The same basic principles can be used to date other materials with various chemical methods, if the age of the site being excavated is appropriate for them. For instance, when trying to date a stone tool from Oldaway Gorge, which is a crucial site for understanding human origins, potassium-argon dating can be useful. This method measures the difference between the amount of potassium in the rock and the amount of argon in it, because potassium decays and becomes argon over time. But it takes a very long time for the decay to happen, and so this method is best used when something is between 200,000 and 5 million years old. In such cases, it would also be impossible to use radiocarbon dating, which works on organic remains but not stone tools and is useful only for dating things within the last 50,000 years. Thermoluminescence might be used on certain objects found at sites with a younger age. Thermoluminescence can measure the absolute age of something made from clay, like a storage pot, by measuring the amount of electromagnetic or ionizing radiation still in it. Specifically, it can indicate how long it has been since the object was baked or fired in a kiln. Researchers have found that the object has to have been heated up above 450 degrees centigrade or the technique won't work. A similar, but newer and still experimental, method is something called rehydroxylation, which measures the amount of water that is in a piece of pottery. I first heard about it in 2010 at a mini conference that was held at Megiddo during our summer excavations that year, and how old is this and why is it preserved? 273. Thought it was a really interesting and promising procedure. It seems that, when a piece of pottery is fired in a kiln, all the water in the clay evaporates during the process. As soon as the piece of pottery is taken out of the kiln and cools off, it begins to absorb water from the atmosphere again at a constant, slow rate, regardless of the environment of the vessel. Thus, by measuring the amount of water in a sherd, it is possible to determine the last time that it was fired, and thus probably its age. There can be problems with measuring rehydroxylation, and we were told the story of the original researchers being given a medieval brick from Canterbury and trying this method on it, only to get results again and again saying that it was only about 66 years old, according to the rehydroxylation analysis. And yet, they knew it had to be much older than that. It eventually turned out that the brick had been in an area of Canterbury that had been bombed during World War II and was caught in the ensuing incendiary fire. The fire had reset the water content of the brick back to zero as of the 1940s, and so the dating method clearly worked, but it no longer measured the date of the brick's original firing back in the medieval period. It also is possible to do something similar with a piece of obsidian, which is called obsidian hydration. Obsidian is volcanic glass that was highly prized in antiquity for its sharpness, and in fact is still used in some surgical scalpels today. It also absorbs water at a constant and well-defined rate once it is exposed to air, and so measuring the amount of water in a particular piece of obsidian can be used to date obsidian tools. Stratigraphy, pottery seriation, and object association also can all be used as relative dating methods, especially if it is not possible to generate a precise absolute date otherwise. We have discussed all these in a previous chapter, and so here it is simply worthwhile remembering that one way to date something can be as simple as seeing what was found with it, in other words, in association with it or in the same context, like a stone tool found with a datable organic object. For example, if an excavator finds a coin minted by the Roman Emperor Vespasian in a grave, clearly the grave cannot date from before Vespasian's time. Thus, everything in the grave along with the coin should be from about the same period, unless it was an heirloom at the 274 digging deeper 3 time that it was buried, which does happen. Similarly, if an Egyptian scarab with the cartouche of Amenhotep III is found on the floor of the room in an ancient house or palace that is being excavated, then everything else on the floor probably dates to the 14th century BCE, when Amenhotep III was ruling Egypt. At Tel Kabri, for instance, on the floor of one of our rooms in the palace, we found a type of scarab that dates specifically to the Hyksos period, that is, the 17th to 16th century BCE. This gave us an indication of the date for that room, which was then confirmed by the radiocarbon dates that we got from some of the charcoal samples that we submitted for analysis. As we discussed in Chapter 10 on the Yalubaran shipwreck, the excavators were able to use no fewer than 4 ways to date their ship: radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, the type of Minoan and Mycenaean pottery on board, and the fact that they found a scarab of Nefertiti. All these combine to point to a relative date in the Late Bronze Age and an absolute date of about 1300 BCE for the time that the boat sank. Each dating method has its own limitations and uncertainties, and so when 4 separate methods point to the same approximate date, the archaeologist can offer that date with a great degree of certainty. Terracotta Warriors. How old is this and why is it preserved? 275. One of the best examples of using association to date an entire group of objects when they are all in the same approximate context, or grouped around one major central element, are the large pits containing the Terracotta Warriors in China, which were all associated with one emperor's tomb. It was near Xi'an, the capital city of China's Shaanxi province, that farmers digging a well in 1974 first came across what they thought was a rock. It turned out to be the head and body of a fully armed and life-size warrior made from terracotta. In the decades that have gone by since, archaeologists have uncovered at the site thousands of warriors, as well as terracotta horses and chariots. Together, they are commonly referred to as the Terracotta Army or the Terracotta Warriors. The soldiers, horses, and chariots that make up the army were buried more than 2,000 years ago, in 210 BCE. They were meant to accompany the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, into the afterlife. Qin, who ruled from 221 to 210 BCE, was able to unify China for the first time, bringing the period of the warring states to an end. He died suddenly while on a tour with the army. His tomb and the related pits may well have served as a memorial to his importance in Chinese society, even though his dynasty did not last much longer than he did, for it was overthrown by the Han dynasty just 4 years later, in 206 BCE. The Han emperors then ruled for the next 4 centuries, until 220 CE. So far, Emperor Qin's terracotta warriors have been found in 3 large pits, with much more still to be uncovered. There are estimated to be between 6,000 and 8,000 warriors, as well as several hundred horses and perhaps dozens of chariots in these pits, which were constructed near Qin's mausoleum. There's a 4th pit as well, but it was found almost completely empty. About a mile from the pits is Emperor Qin's tomb itself. It hasn't been excavated yet, though it's pretty obvious where it is, since the huge mound that covers it is about 140 feet tall. According to the writings of the Grand Historian of China, which date to about a century after the death of the emperor, it took more than 700,000 workers working for about 36 years to construct the tomb. Although we might not be able to take this figure at face value, it probably did require a tremendous number of workers to build the tomb, and 276 digging deeper 3. Probably the pits as well, just as it did for the construction of the pyramids in Egypt more than 2,000 years earlier. The interior of the tomb is supposedly magnificent, with a 3-dimensional map that includes flowing rivers made of mercury. It is also supposed to contain all sorts of traps for the unwary tomb robber. One ancient source says specifically that craftsmen were ordered to fix up crossbows so that any thief breaking in would be shot. Someday archaeologists will excavate the tomb, but in the meantime, the surrounding pits are amazing enough. The first pit to be discovered, which is now appropriately referred to as pit number 1, has about 6,000 terracotta warriors, all life-size. They are standing in rows, as if at attention in a parade drill. The weapons they hold are real ones. They are quite spectacular, even though most of the paint that originally colored their faces, mustaches, beards, and uniforms is now gone, possibly because of a fire that seems to have affected much of the pit or because of the type of soil in which they were buried. But most likely because of exposure to the air after they were excavated. Pit number 2 has at least 1,000 more warriors, as well as horses and chariots. Pit number 3 has fewer than 100 warriors, some horses, and a chariot, as well as some intact weapons. Some scholars have interpreted this last pit as the headquarters for the army commanders, in part because the figures are taller and are drawn up in battle formation, but that is just a working hypothesis. Overall, each of the figures in these pits appears to be an individual, distinguished by facial hair, a uniform, or something that they are holding, like a spear, a sword, a shield, or a crossbow. In reality, though, it seems that there are only about 8 different facial types, though there are as many as 25 different styles of mustaches and beards. It now seems that the warriors were constructed as if they were on an assembly line, with the head, arms, legs, and body all made separately and then attached. There are areas in the pits where broken pieces can be seen, and even bodies that don't yet have the heads attached, which might indicate that they were made right on site. It took skilled craftsmen to make these. According to one report, the names of 85 sculptors have been found on various parts of the figures. In 2010, 114 additional warriors were discovered in pit number 1. Many of them were brightly painted, and our technology had advanced. How old is this and why is it preserved? 277. Enough since 1974 that this time the archaeologists were able to conserve the paint quickly enough that it stayed attached to the figures and did not flake off. In 2014, researchers announced that they had discovered more about the colors that were once painted on the warriors, including the binding agent that helped the paint adhere to the life-sized figures. It turns out that several layers of lacquer were placed on the terracotta, with a layer of polychrome applied on top of that. Within the polychrome was animal blue that helped bind this outer layer of paint to the layers of lacquer below. Interest in the Terracotta Warriors has led to other discoveries in Shanxi province. In fact, about 25 miles from Emperor Qin's tomb, more pits with different types of terracotta warriors were found in 1990, when a new airport was being built to handle the masses of tourists that began arriving. These warriors are associated with two tombs belonging to the later Han Emperor Jin and his wife, who lived circa 188-144 BCE. Warriors in this group are solid rather than hollow like the warriors in Qin's pits, and they're also much smaller, less than 2 feet high. They also are completely naked, with no arms. They may have originally been draped with clothing and had arms inserted, perhaps of precious metals that were later robbed, but right now they look very, very strange. Paul Bon reports that the estimates for the number of these figures in the pits associated with these two tombs range anywhere from 10,000 to 1,000,000. Other pits near Qin's tomb also have been excavated. They contained figures of acrobats and of musicians playing various instruments. There also are courtiers and officials, as well as what appears to be a miniature version of the imperial stables. In 2014, the tomb of Emperor Qin's grandmother was discovered and excavated. Within it were the skeletons of 12 real horses and the 2 carriages that they were originally pulling. As for the mound containing Qin's tomb itself, as mentioned, it has not yet been excavated, in part because we are waiting for our technology to get even better. Some remote sensing has been done, indicating that there are chambers inside the mound, but it has been hypothesized that the emperor's burial chamber may be as much as 278 digging deeper 300 feet below the top of the mound. We hope to someday see what lies within. PPPP. The second question is a bit more complicated to answer. How can things that old still be preserved? Why haven't they crumbled to dust? The answer is that a lot of ancient things have crumbled to dust or have been otherwise destroyed. Only a small percentage of what once existed has survived to the present. Inorganic materials like stone and metal frequently survive, though silver will turn purple in the ground, bronze will turn green, and so on. It's only gold that stays the exact same color. I've only found gold a few times in my career, but I've found a lot of bronze, including my petrified monkey's paw. Other items that are made of organic or perishable goods are not as durable, and it can be rare to find things like textiles or leather sandals at most archaeological sites. Happily, though, sometimes such items, and human bodies, are preserved, usually in conditions of moisture and temperature extremes, in other words, places that are very dry, very cold, very wet, or without oxygen. A few very interesting examples from each such location can be readily discussed. For example, perishable objects have survived in the very dry conditions within King Tut's tomb in Egypt, where all the wooden furniture and boxes and chariots were found, still completely intact. The wooden boats buried by the pyramids also have survived for the same reason, as have so many mummy coffins and pieces of papyrus from ancient Egypt. Other mummies preserved by dry conditions in a desert come from much further away, in China. These, some as much as 4,000 years old, were first reported to the rest of the world by a professor of Chinese studies at the University of Pennsylvania named Victor Mayer. He spotted them in a museum in the city of Urumqi, in a remote part of China north of Tibet, known as the Tarim Basin. He began to study them, as did Professor Elizabeth Barber of Occidental College in California. Mayer and Barber have both published books about the mummies, which were extremely well preserved because of the very dry conditions of the desert environment where they were buried. How old is this and why is it preserved? 279. What is unique about some of the mummies is that, even though they are found in China, they have Caucasoid or European features, including brown hair and long noses. They also were buried with textiles and cloth that looks a lot like plaid. Their DNA suggests that they may be of Western origin, with links to Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and possibly even Europe. Studies of these mummies are still ongoing, but perhaps we should not be particularly surprised by these initial findings. The Silk Road, which connected China in the east to the Mediterranean on the west from the 2nd century BCE on, is known to have run through the Darim Basin, and in fact some of the mummies were brought to the United States in 2010, as part of a traveling exhibition on the Silk Route in antiquity. In contrast, the bodies of Otzi the Iceman, found in the Alps in 1991, the Siberian Princess, discovered in 1993, and Juanita the Ice Maiden, discovered in Peru in 1995, were all found preserved in extremely cold conditions. Otzi especially has been the subject of much analysis and discussion since he was accidentally discovered by hikers in the Alps, on the border between Austria and Italy. He spawned a worldwide craze, especially in the region where he was found, where one can now purchase Otzi wine, Otzi chocolate, and, perhaps most relevant of all, Otzi ice cream. At first it was thought that Otzi was a murder victim and so the police were called in. This was most definitely a cold case, though, since not only was Otzi encased in ice, but it turns out that he had been lying there for more than 5,000 years. In fact, it now looks like Otzi died in about 3200 BCE, which is more than 600 years before the pyramids in Egypt were built. Otzi's body lay wedged in a hollow formed by some rocks. A glacier creeping down the slope swept right over the rocks and his body, so that he was preserved under many feet of ice and snow for thousands of years. In 1991, a sandstorm in faraway North Africa sent sand up into the atmosphere that eventually settled on the ice above Otzi. The sand, absorbing the sun's rays, melted the ice and exposed Otzi's head, shoulders, and upper body. The police, unaware that this was an ancient body, hacked Otzi out of the ice, damaging his body as well as his belongings, which were 280 digging deeper 3 scattered around him. Once scientists realized this was not a wayward hiker but was far more ancient, scientific archaeological excavations were carried out in 1992. These retrieved additional artifacts, including his bearskin cap. Ever since then, detailed studies have been made of Otzi and his belongings, including a complete workup of his DNA. As it turned out, Otzi had indeed been murdered, as the police who were called to the scene had first thought, though it had taken place several thousand years earlier. It took 10 years before murder could be proven, but the evidence was eventually quite obvious. Even though it hadn't been noticed before, in 2001 an alert radiologist examining X-rays and CT scans that had been taken of Otzi saw a foreign object embedded in his back, just below his left shoulder. It turned out to be an arrowhead, with a corresponding entry wound several inches below, which means whoever shot him was standing below Otzi and shooting upward. It was subsequently determined that the arrowhead had severed an artery, meaning that Otzi had probably bled to death. It also means that he was shot in the back, which implies murder rather than an accident. The fact that he has a defensive cut on his hand as well indicates that some sort of fight had taken place and that he may have been fleeing from the battle when he was fatally shot. Otzi has turned out to be incredibly important. The scientific discoveries, which came one after the other, have been published in a series of peer-reviewed and prestigious journals, including Science, the Journal of Archaeological Science, and The Lancet, among others. Among the discoveries that were made, scientists determined that Otzi had brown hair and deep-set brown eyes, a beard, and sunken cheeks. He was probably about 5 feet, 2 inches tall and weighed about 110 pounds at the time of his death, which occurred when he was between 40 and 50 years old. The strontium isotopes in his tooth enamel, which can be used to determine where someone lived during their childhood years, indicate that he probably lived his whole life near where he died, within a 60-kilometer radius and most likely in a nearby valley in Italy. Otzi's lungs were blackened, probably from inhaling smoke from campfires, either inside caves or outdoors. He suffered from tooth decay and had been ill several times in the months just before he died. How old is this and why is it preserved? 281. Scientists and archaeologists were able to analyze the contents of his intestine, including pollen, which indicated that he had probably died in late spring or early summer. His last meal included red deer meat, bread made from einkorn, and some plums. In addition, his second tallest meal included ibex meat, cereals, and various other plants. In 2016, scientists who were continuing to study the contents of Otzi's stomach also announced that they had mapped the genome of the oldest known pathogen, a bacterium named H. pylori that can cause ulcers. The bacterium may provide a clue to human migration patterns, for it is an Asian strain, and not the more usual Asian-African hybrids present in today's European population. This discovery suggests that the additional migrations that brought African strains to Europe had not yet taken place by Otzi's time. More and more such genetic studies are taking place, ranging from investigation of King Richard III's body, discovered under a parking lot in England, and King Tut's mummy. It is likely that such studies will become even more important to archaeology in the future. Otzi also had 61 tattoos, which were made by rubbing charcoal into cuts made in his skin. These are the oldest tattoos yet known, but they are mostly lines and crosses rather than designs or images. In an interesting, and unexplained, related piece of trivia, the actor Brad Pitt now reportedly has a tattoo of Otzi on his left forearm. Hollywood meets archaeology? Personally, I would have thought that a tattoo of Achilles would have made more sense, since it would be relevant to his starring role in the 2004 movie Troy. Otzi was quite the well-dressed man, with 3 layers of clothing. Underneath everything, he wore undergarments made from goatskin. He had leggings made of fur, a coat of leather, and a grass cape over it all, plus a hat made of fur from a brown bear. On his feet, he had leather shoes insulated with straw. In 2004, a professor in the Czech Republic made a pair just like them and went hiking. He said that he didn't get blisters and that they were more comfortable than his normal hiking shoes. All this has now been recreated in several places, including the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in northern Italy, which is Otzi's current home. Among his other possessions and equipment were a number of objects that shed additional light on Otzi and his environment and way. 282 Digging Deeper 3 of life. He had 2 arrows with flint tips and a kit to repair them, plus a quiver full of half-finished arrows, a partly finished long bow, a dagger with a flint blade, and an axe with a copper blade. Archaeologists also recovered a fire starter kit, a birch bark container that had embers from his fire, and a bone needle. And Otzi had a backpack in which he carried many of these possessions. Otzi is not the only ancient person to have been found on ice. In 1993, a mummified body known as the Siberian Princess or Ice Maiden was found on the Yukok Plateau in southern Siberia, near the border with China. Dating to the 5th century BCE, she was about 25 years old when she died, perhaps from breast cancer. She was buried with 6 horses, all saddled and bridled, probably meant to accompany her into the afterlife. This perhaps makes a great deal of sense, because it is thought that the princess was a member of the Pazyryk people, a nomadic group described by the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, who spent most of their lives on horseback. She is best known for her numerous tattoos, which put Otzi's to shame, even though his are nearly 3,000 years older. Her tattoos, primarily on her left shoulder and arm, include a mythological animal, which looks like a deer with a griffin's head and antlers that also have griffin's heads at the ends. Other bodies buried nearby, of men identified as warriors, some of whom were dug up decades earlier, have similar tattoos. One has them on both arms, his back, and his lower leg. 2 years later, in 1995, anthropologist Johann Reinhard found a mummy of a 12 to 14-year-old Inca female on Mount Amparo in Peru. She also is occasionally called the Ice Maiden, but since that causes confusion with the mummy from Siberia, more usually she is simply Juanita. Reinhard found her near the peak of the mountain, at a height of more than 6,000 meters above sea level, where she had been buried more than 500 years ago. He had climbed the mountain to photograph a nearby volcano that was erupting, thinking he could get a good picture from there. It didn't seem to be a likely place for an Inca sacrifice, and yet there she was, exposed to the elements because the ash from the volcano had melted some of the ice that had protected her. In his book, The Ice Maiden, Reinhard How Old Is This and Why Is It Preserved? 283 describes carrying her down the mountain in his backpack, since she weighed only 80 pounds. She is not the only such Inca mummy, for others have been discovered as well, including 2 more that Reinhard also found on Mount Amparo, a boy and a girl located 1,000 feet below the summit, when he returned with a full team to explore the mountain systematically. One television show, broadcast by PBS, estimated that there may be hundreds more such Inca children encased in what are now ice tombs on top of peaks in the Andes, where more than 115 Inca sacred ceremonial sites have been found. The question of who these children were and why they were left to die on mountaintops still engages anthropologists and archaeologists working in the region today. As for finding objects and bodies that have been preserved in waterlogged conditions, a small wooden writing tablet that dates back to the 8th century BCE was found submerged in a well at the site of Nimrud in Iraq. Pieces of two more were found in the Ulubaran shipwreck, as we have mentioned, where they had been preserved 140–170 feet below the surface of the Mediterranean Sea for more than 3,000 years. The so-called bog bodies, which have been found in places like Denmark and England, are among the best-known examples of organic material that has been preserved in a waterlogged environment. These bog bodies have been so well preserved that it is possible to see individual whiskers in a beard and the strands of the rope around a victim's neck. Several hundred such bodies have been uncovered in a variety of places in England and Europe within once swampy areas, called bogs or fens. Bogs contain peat that is a deposit of dead and decayed plant material, usually moss. Peat can be used as fuel or as insulation on cottage roofs. The workers who dig in these bogs occasionally find human remains, of which the soft tissues have been almost completely preserved because of the acidic conditions and the lack of oxygen in the bogs, even though the bones themselves are long gone. One such body, known as Lindoman, was found in northwestern England in 1984, in the Lindale Moss Bog. The autopsy indicates that he was about 25 years old when he died. He had been hit twice on the head with a heavy object, then strangled by a thin cord, which also broke his neck, and finally had his throat cut for good measure. It's 284 Digging Deeper 3. Is not clear whether he was murdered or ritually sacrificed. This is definitely what we would consider a cold case, because he was killed about 2,000 years ago, sometime during the 1st or early 2nd century CE. Because of the conditions in which he lay for all those centuries, his skin and hair are very well preserved, including his beard and mustache. His fingernails are also so well preserved that we can tell they were manicured. Some of his internal organs also are preserved. They contain parts of what was probably his last meal, including a piece of unleavened bread made from wheat and barley, which had been cooked over a fire. A similarly preserved body was found in 1950 by two workers cutting peat in a bog in Denmark, not far from the town of Silkeborg. Known as the Talon Man, he dates to the 4th century BCE, and so he is about 500 years older than Lindoman. In his case, we can see every detail of the leather cap that is still on his head and the belt that is around his waist, as well as the stubble on his face and the rope around his neck that was used to hang him. The two workers who found him thought that he was a murder victim, and he may well have been, but again his death occurred nearly 2,500 years ago, and it is unclear why he was killed. He was probably about 40 years old at the time of his death. Because his stomach and intestines were preserved, the archaeologists who were called in to examine him were able to do analyses and determine that his last meal had been a sort of porridge. If we turn to examples of artifacts and bodies preserved in areas with little or no oxygen, obviously such places are pretty rare in the world, but they do exist in regions like deep in the Black Sea, below 200 meters. Where the water is very still and oxygen doesn't circulate to the bottom. Since there's really no oxygen, there's no reason for anything to disintegrate, because there's nothing alive there even at the microscopic level that could damage the artifacts. This is why Bob Ballard found amazing things when he sent a remotely operated vehicle down into the depths of the Black Sea in 1999 and again in 2007. Most people may know Ballard as the discoverer of the Titanic, but in archaeology he is perhaps better known for his discoveries in the How old is this and why ISIT preserved? 285. Black Sea. He found a Neolithic settlement, an ancient shoreline, and a beach that are now far below the current surface of the sea, meaning that the whole area probably flooded sometime in antiquity. Two Columbia University professors suggest that such a cataclysmic event may have taken place about 7,500 years ago, ca 5,500 BCE. Ballard also has found several shipwrecks from the Roman and Byzantine periods, dating between 1,000 and 1,500 or more years ago. In at least one of them, the wood of the boat is so well preserved that the tool marks on the individual pieces of wood from when the boats were being built are still visible. And one of the jars that they brought up had the original beeswax still sealing the top closed. Not all ships have been as well preserved as the one that Ballard found in the Black Sea or the Egyptian ships by the pyramids. Other ships, such as the Anglo-Saxon ship found at Sutton Hoo in England and a Viking ship recently found in Scotland, have left only negative impressions in the soil. Their poor state of preservation is far more typical of artifacts that have been found simply buried in the earth rather than in extreme environmental conditions. But these examples also show how even those badly preserved remains can be interpreted by savvy archaeologists working from the pattern of what has been left behind. Take, for instance, the Sutton Hoo ship in Suffolk, England. It is 27 meters long and was found in 1939 by an archaeologist named Basil Brown. The owner of the property had invited Brown to excavate a large mound, one of many on her land, in southeastern England. Within the mound, he found the remains of this ship. There are many interesting things about the ship, which probably dates to sometime between 620 and 650 CE. This was an era during the Anglo-Saxon period, which began about 450 CE after the end of Roman occupation, when new immigrants arrived from continental Europe and lasted until the Norman conquest in 1066 CE. Perhaps most interesting is that the ship isn't actually there anymore, and yet its remains can still be seen perfectly well. That is because, although the wood of the ship is completely gone, it is very clear where it once was. The dirt had stains where the wood has disintegrated. There are raised ridges in the soil running the width of the ship, spaced just a 286 digging deeper 3 few feet apart for its entire length, and there are rusted iron nails, which once held the pieces of wood together. What Brown discovered is the shadow of the boat, rather than the boat itself. So, why bury a boat on land and not sink it in the water? Most archaeologists think that the boat was buried with its owner, that is, it served as a final resting place for a warrior, or a king, or someone else deserving of such an honor. But, perhaps strangely enough, there's no remains of the body in the boat or anywhere near it, at least that has been found so far. That seems a bit strange. If this was a burial, where is the body? One possibility is that the body and the bones have decomposed so much that they have simply vanished, just like the wood of the ship. If so, they left no mark at all. That's the scenario that most people believe. Another possibility is that there never was a body. If that's the case, then this is what is known as a cenotaph, that is, a monument to someone who was buried elsewhere. A lot of war monuments today are basically cenotaphs, and it might be that the Sutton Hoo ship is an ancient war monument, perhaps a commemoration of a battle fought by the Anglo-Saxons in this part of England. But even if it didn't yield a body, the Sutton Hoo ship proved to be a treasure trove in other respects. The center of the boat held a number of objects, shoulder clasps made of gold and with enamel inlays, which were probably attached to a cloth tunic or shirt that has perished, a solid gold belt buckle with an intricate design and a metal lid with enamel inlays. Which is all that remains of what was once probably a purse, with the cloth or leather part now gone, drinking horns inlaid with fancy designs. These artifacts again indicate that this is no ordinary burial, and one can only imagine the parties and celebrations at which they were once used. One of the objects that has stirred the most interest is an iron helmet, complete with a faceplate with holes for the eyes and both a nose and a mouth made of metal. Parts of it are overlaid with gold, as decoration. It must have been very expensive back in the day and probably belonged to someone either wealthy or powerful or both. In 2011, a similar discovery of a phantom ship was made on the western coast of Scotland, on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. Here, in a burial that dates to the 10th century CE, is what appears to be a Viking warrior buried in his boat. At that time, this region was located along a How old is this and why is it preserved? 287. Primary north-south sea route between Ireland and Norway, and Viking houses have been found on the nearby Hebrides Islands. The grave is 5 feet wide and about 17 feet long, which is just enough to hold the entire boat. Just like the Sutton Hoo boat, the wood of this boat has decayed and is now completely missing, apart from a few remnants here and there. Again, the archaeologists found the iron rivets that had once held the boat together, about 200 of them, and they could easily see the shape of the boat because of the impression it left in the earth. In this case, we do know for certain that there once was a body here, because the archaeologists found a few teeth and some fragments from an arm bone. They also found the remains of his iron sword and parts of his shield, which had been placed on his chest. The boat contained the Viking spear, a bronze pin, and a bronze piece from what may have been a drinking horn. PPPP. In this chapter 1 have elaborated upon my answer to the journalist who asked how we archaeologists can be so certain of our dates. I hope it is now a bit clearer how we date things, but it also should be clear that we aren't always able to pin something down to a specific year and why there is frequently some wiggle room, especially in radiocarbon dating, in which dates are always given with a plus or minus factor and a statistical probability. New techniques are being invented and applied fairly often, and so I suspect that our ability to date things from the past will continue to get more accurate in the future. I have also touched briefly upon how some things have been preserved for us to find, especially in terms of organic materials that may require extreme conditions in order to survive. It will almost certainly also be possible to improve our methods in the excavation of organic objects or materials, including those that do not take kindly to being exposed by archaeologists after centuries or millennia of burial. Such improvements can already be seen, for example, in the most recently excavated Terracotta Warriors in China, where the brilliant paint that decorated them is still visible and has been successfully preserved and investigated by the archaeologists. Rt6 New World Archeology. In the 1920s, when aviators first started flying over a high desert region in inland Peru, they noticed long straight lines and huge figures drawn in the dry desert soil. Now known world. Wide as the Nazca Lines, the figures technically are geoglyphs and include a spider, a dog, birds, monkeys, a tree, and a strange figure that looks like an ancient astronaut. Nearly half a century later, in 1968, Erich von Däniken published a book called Chariots of the Gods. In it, he suggested that the Nazca Lines must have been created for, or by, ancient astronauts. He argued that only people who could see the figures from the air could have drawn them, because they can't really be recognized at ground level. He also suggested that the long straight lines were landing strips for ancient aircraft or spaceships. As he wrote, "What is wrong with the idea that the lines were laid out to say to the gods, 'Land here'? Everything has been prepared as you ordered." What's wrong with that, he asks? Well, pretty much everything. To begin with, invoking ancient aliens to explain the Nazca Lines is a 1-7. Lines in the sand, cities in the sky. 292 Chapter 17. Conclusion with which almost all archaeologists completely disagree. And yet a considerable portion of the general public takes von Däniken's theories seriously, so much so that his books have sold millions over the years. In 2003, von Däniken even opened up a theme park in Switzerland, called Mystery Park. One of the 7 pavilions at the park was devoted to a display and discussion of the Nazca Lines. Unfortunately for von Däniken, even though there was an initial burst of enthusiasm, attendance at the amusement park quickly dropped. Although the 1 millionth visitor came through in October 2006, the park closed down just a month later. In any event, the Nazca Lines are very real and are well worth a visit, even if ancient astronauts didn't build them. They are now a protected site, and most tourists can't walk through the area. It is best to arrange for a low-flying airplane, helicopter, or hot air balloon, for the lines really are best seen from the air. They were in the news again in August 2014, when new images were spotted after sandstorms and high winds hit the area. They also made headlines around the world later that same year, in December 2014, when Greenpeace volunteers laid out a huge message saying time for change. The future is renewable. The Greenpeace people came under heavy criticism for damaging the ancient site in their zeal to protect the future, which is, quite frankly, rather ironic. PPPP. The Nazca Lines are in the high desert of southern Peru, about 200 miles from Machu Picchu, which we will discuss later in this chapter. As mentioned, they were not made by ancient astronauts. Instead, they were made by the local indigenous group known as the Nazca, who lived in this area between 200 BC and 600 CE and whose graves and other ancient settlement remains are near the lines. We know this in part because of the similarity with the designs found on Nazca pottery, which include designs of animals, birds, and humans in red, white, and black paint on the vessels. In addition, carbon-14 dating on the wooden stakes that were found at the end of some of the lines indicates a date of about 525 CE, plus or minus 80. Lines eye in the sand, cities eye in the sky 293 years, so somewhere between 445 CE and 605 CE, which matches well with the known date for the Nazca presence in this area. It is not generally known outside the profession, but the Nazca culture was not the first to create geoglyphs in this region. An earlier culture known as the Paracas, from which the Nazca might have evolved, also created geoglyphs in the desert just a bit further to the north, near the modern town of Palpa. These date hundreds of years earlier, in some cases. They are mostly found on the sides of hills rather than on the desert floor and include enigmatic human figures as well as more of the landing strips to which von Daniken refers. Both sets of figures, Paracas and Nazca, were collectively declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1994. The Nazca lines drawn in the desert are huge, and there are hundreds of them, ranging from basic lines that go for miles to very complex and stylized depictions of creatures. Simply moving the oxidized rocks that form the top layer here in the desert to reveal the lighter colored sand that lies underneath created the lines and pictures. By doing this as a series of narrow lines, either straight or curved, it is possible to create a picture that is very easily seen from above, even if it isn't always easily identifiable what it is. In fact, in some cases, it's not clear at all what is being portrayed. There's one animal that looks a bit like a cross between a scared cat and some sort of weird dog. It is very cartoonish, with completely straight legs and only 3 or 4 digits on each foot. Another one is most definitely a monkey, but without any eyes or nose and with 4 digits on one hand but 5 on the other. Speaking of hands, one of the Nazca figures is simply called the hands, though it actually looks more like another monkey but unfinished. It also doesn't have any eyes or nose and again has 4 digits on one hand and 5 on the other. There is also a very convincing, though not particularly scary, spider that is 150 feet long. One of its hind legs goes far past the bounds of the picture, not to mention reality. It might represent the silken thread that the spider is attached to, but they've done it very strangely by making it an extension of one of the legs. There's also a huge stylized tree and a similarly large stylized bird-like figure known as the heron, as well as a 300-foot-long 294 Chapter 17 hummingbird, with a beak that is about the same length as its body. Another bird is known as the condor and a fourth bird is called the parrot, though it doesn't look much like one to me. Finally, there is the figure sometimes called the astronaut, who was created on the side of a hill, much like the earlier Paracas drawings that are further to the north. This figure is almost 100 feet tall, with a bubble head and big owl-like eyes. Archaeologists more usually call him the Owlman, a nickname acquired back in 1949. One of his arms is pointing up, the other is pointing down. He doesn't look much like an astronaut, and many reasonable explanations have emerged for what he might be doing, including perhaps holding a fishing net and wearing a traditional poncho. A lot of people have made suggestions about the Nazca Lines since they were noticed in the 1920s, ranging from pseudo-archaeologists working on their own to scientists sponsored by the National Geographic Society and other institutions. One of the very first archaeological studies and systematic description of the lines was conducted by Berkeley anthropologist Alfred Kroeber in 1926, though his findings would not be published for another 70 years. Theories to explain the existence of the lines and other designs include von Daniken's ancient aliens using the region as landing strips, Paul Kosak's and Maria Reich's ideas about the figures representing constellations in the form of an astronomical calendar. Anthropological hypotheses involving the identification and tracking of underground water sources in this dry desert, and suggestions that they were ceremonial paths for performing religious rituals of the Paracas and Nazca cultures. Most recently, a joint German-Peruvian expedition has been documenting and studying the geoglyphs in both the Nazca area and the Palpa region to the north. They are finding the ruins of many Nazca villages, with glyphs near virtually every settlement. The findings suggest a long history of such glyphs in the region, and some are even superimposed upon others. It also is now clear that the earliest were created on hillsides, from where they could be seen from the plain below, rather than necessitate a view from the air. Even the more complex ones, like the hummingbird, have now been shown to be single-line drawings, in which one can start walking at a specific point and walk along the line without ever having to cross another line. Thus, it is quite lines eye in the sand, cities eye in the sky 295. Possible that these were used as ceremonial processions, as has been suggested. In any case, there is simply no need to invoke extraterrestrial visitors in order to explain the amazing Nazca Lines. The phenomenon of building these geoglyph figures on the ground has a long tradition over many centuries in many places in Peru, most of which were very visible to the people for whom they were made. It seems to be a regional form of artistic, religious, and cultural expression, not landing strips for extraterrestrials. Nor were they outside the skill level of our predecessors on this planet, who were advanced enough not to need outside assistance in such building projects.